All right, we will go ahead and get started on our last day of lecture. There's going to be 2 videos for this class, though. We're doing 2 chapters, just very, kind of briefly for each one. So this lecture video will be on chapter 30, and then there'll be another one for chapter 31. Okay, so looking ahead at some housekeeping things. We will have an exam over this ecology from chapter 26 on. We did skip chapter 29, and that will be on Tuesday. I will get the exam review posted here hopefully shortly for that. And then that's our last regular class period. And then we will have the final on Friday, May 8th. Okay, there's no class for us next Wednesday because you'll be perhaps taking other finals then. And I believe I already announced, but you will be able to take the final exam at any time on May 8th. We don't have to stick to that 10:15 to 12:15 time slot that we were originally assigned. Okay. And as far as reviewing for the final, there's not going to be a specific review sheet for the final. You will have your old review sheets from the other 5 exams that you can be looking at to go over those and looking at your old exams and so forth. And so if you have any questions about the final, let me know. I may do a little bit of a review as we get a little bit closer into next week. Okay, so this chapter, chapter 30, gets into talking about different ecosystems. So we started out talking about population ecology, and then we moved into community ecology. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the ecosystems. And so ecosystems are basically communities plus the non-living environment. Or you could also say the abiotic, which is the non-living, and the biotic factors. Okay, so it's a particular area or a particular space that in an ecosystem within that would be all of the living and the non-living components. Okay, so different places around the world have different types of ecosystems, obviously, and different places around the world have different abundance of species. Okay, we call this biodiversity. So some places have a lot of biodiversity, like the tropical rainforest, and other places, like the desert, have less biodiversity. And a lot of that is going to depend on basically photosynthesis of the producers. Okay. Those organisms basically at the bottom of the food chain. And so the diversity of life is basically distributed unevenly because some ecosystems, some parts of the world, the photosynthesizers are able to do very well. In other places, it's too hot or dry or cold or whatever for those photosynthesizers to be working at really efficient levels to produce a wide variety of species. Okay, so weather patterns are going to really affect different types of ecosystems and where they're located around the world. And so weather patterns, including temperature and rainfall or precipitation, over long periods of time in a particular area make up its climate. Okay, this could also include wind and other factors as well, but the two main ones is going to be temperature and precipitation. And again, this is a long-term effect on a climate in a particular area. Okay, so the climate in a region is going to be a good predictor of what kind of plant species can be present in a terrestrial ecosystem. Okay, so if we know the climate, that's weird.
A lot of people who did go back to the beach for the first time may have noticed the turn of the red.
I was watching a video on red tide earlier, and apparently it decided to play. I'm going to have you guys watch this video, and I'll explain why here in a little bit, but I'm not sure why my computer started to play it. So weather patterns are going to be important for making up what type of ecosystem there's going to be based on how well the photosynthesizers can produce to basically convert those inorganic molecules, inorganic carbon, sunlight energy into organic molecules that organisms can use. Okay, so here's some examples of how temperature and rainfall influence the distribution of land or terrestrial ecosystems. Okay, we're going to look at terrestrial ecosystems in this chapter and also aquatic ecosystems. And before we talk about the terrestrial ones, I just wanted to point out in aquatic ecosystems, light and temperature are going to be the major influences, and light can penetrate down about 650 feet in basically oceans or deep, deep lakes. Okay, past that, there's not going to be light that penetrates, and so photosynthesis is not going to be able to take place below this level. And we'll talk about those photic and aphotic zones a little bit later. But in terrestrial ecosystems, rainfall and temperature are going to be the major effects. In aquatic ecosystems, light and temperature are going to be the major effects. Okay, so looking at precipitation versus temperature, okay, if there's low precipitation but high temperatures, that's obviously going to give us a desert. Okay, not much rainfall, but high temperatures, that gives us the deserts. Okay, on the other end of that spectrum, if we have high temperatures and high rainfall, that's going to give us the tropical rainforest. Okay, low temperature, low precipitation, that's going to give us a tundra. And we're not going to cover every single one of these. I think we're going to get most of them. But you might want to look back here as we go through some of these different ecosystems or these biomes and look at where they are on this chart. Okay, so moderate precipitation, moderate temperature, grassland. Okay, so you might want to look back here as we go through. Okay, another thing, your book really goes through and talks a lot about climate and distance from equator and the curvature of the earth, the rotation on the axis of the earth, and all kinds of different things. And just for the sake of time, and there's so much information in this chapter, we're going to skip that part. But one thing that I wanted to mention, I thought was kind of interesting, is that as you go up in elevation or altitude, the regions of the mountainous areas or lower levels, the lower elevations, sort of appear to be like or kind of mimic those of latitude. Okay, so let me find this. Okay, so here is the equator. Okay, here's 30 degrees north latitude, 60 degrees south latitude. And so as you're near the equator, you know that it's very warm, a lot of rainfall, and you have like your tropical rainforests near the equator here. Okay, and then as you get farther away from the equator, going north or south in latitude, you get the ice packs, the tundra, some of those other types of climates. Well, if you've ever gone to like the top of Pikes Peak or some of the other 14ers in Colorado, you may have noticed similar situations. Okay, so if you at the top of Pikes Peak, there's no vegetation, there's no trees. It's basically like a um, polar region. Okay, then if you go down a little bit, we have what's called the alpine tundra. Okay, then you have some coniferous forests. Then you maybe even probably not at Pikes Peak because it's not low enough. But if you go down in elevation low enough, you'll have like a grassland type area, some deciduous forests and things like that. So as you go up in elevation, the regions, the ecosystems that are present kind of mimic those as if you were moving from the equator going north or south. So I think that's kind of interesting. One thing that I had to throw out that we were planning on covering this semester was the Colorado ecosystems. And there are 8 of those. And one of them is like the alpine tundra and alpine forests and different areas. And so it would have been kind of neat to relate that to how this diagram is set up. But we do not have the time or the resources for that. Those big posters that are in the hallway right outside our classroom are things that we would have been studying and so forth, and so we can't do that. But I just thought that was kind of neat to point that out in case you hadn't noticed that before. So the Earth supports a variety of different land or terrestrial ecosystems, and they can extend over large areas. And these large scale communities, okay, so basically an ecosystem on a large scale is called a biome. Okay, and they're going to typically be named after the type of vegetation that lives there, okay, the producers or the plant species. And so we've looked at this already. We're not going to cover every single one of these, but typically around the equator you have high rainfall and temperature. Okay, so you're going to have more of your tropical rainforests here. As you go farther from the equator, temperatures usually kind of drop off. Okay, and we'll talk about some of these and what the temperature and rainfall looks like for each one. Okay, so the first one that we're going to talk about, the first biome that we're going to talk about, large scale ecosystem, is the tropical rainforest. Okay, and again, these are going to be near the equator, and the temperature is usually pretty stable, around upper 70s to upper 80s, with little variation throughout the year. Okay, so they don't have those seasonal effects where you cool off in the winter and warm up in the summer. They're pretty much 70, 80 degrees all year long. And they have a high annual rainfall, 100 to 150 or more inches. These evenly warm, moist conditions create the most productive biome on Earth, and that's a tropical rainforest, going to be dominated by broadleaf, BROADLEAF, evergreen trees. Okay, so these are not necessarily coniferous trees. These are trees that stay green all year long. They're not deciduous trees that lose their leaves. And rainforests can be found in Central and South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Rainforests have the highest biodiversity, okay? And biodiversity is basically the total number of species in a biome. And ecologists kind of figure that the rainforests have about half of all of the world's species that live there. It's very, very productive. Plant species are very, very productive there. Tropical rainforest usually has several layers of vegetation. There's the canopy, which is the tops of the trees, where the tallest trees can grow up to 200 feet or more. Then below that, there is other trees that live a little bit shorter, and then there's an understory there where trees are shorter, and then you have other plants like woody vines or epiphytes that grow on those trees. And basically, they don't root down, they receive their nutrients from the air. That's what an epiphyte is. And at the bottom, okay, or at the ground level, there's very little sunlight that passes through in a lot of areas because of the canopy levels above. Another type of biome is the tropical deciduous forest. Okay, so tropical rainforests do not lose their leaves. Remember, deciduous forests lose their leaves. And it's slightly farther north or south from the equator than the tropical rainforest. You still have high rainfall, but it's not this constant little variation. There are pronounced wet and dry seasons. So you get a lot of rainfall in these weeks and very little or none in other weeks. Typical areas where you would see a tropical deciduous rainfall: India, Southeast Asia, Central America, and South America. And so here in North America, our temperate deciduous forests, like in the Northeast or Midwest, they drop their leaves during the wintertime. In the tropical deciduous forests, they drop their leaves during the dry season to minimize water loss. Third biome, okay, is going to be what we call the savanna. And again, that's a little bit more north or south from the equator. Here it's even drier, and so grasses are more dominant because they can survive better on lower rainfall. Typical rainfall in a savanna is about 12 to 40 inches per year, and most of that comes during the rainy season. And then you have a dry season where it may not rain at all. The African savanna supports the most diverse array of large mammals on Earth. And so there's lions and rhinos and zebra and other types of prey animals and so forth. The fourth biome is the desert. And typically deserts are found at 30 degrees north or 30 degrees south latitude. And they are defined, a desert is defined as an area with 10 inches of rain or less per year. And deserts are typically defined more by a lack of precipitation rather than by temperature. Okay, so when you're thinking of a desert, you're basically talking about something that gets 10 inches or less per year. And typically they're hot areas, but not always extremely high temperatures. Deserts vary in how much precipitation they get. Some areas like the Atacama Desert in Chile or the Sahara, parts of the Sahara in Africa, it almost never rains in those places. And then other places could get up to 10 inches like in areas of Utah and the North American deserts. If there is vegetation here, obviously there's not, because there's probably not any precipitation, but usually the vegetation is very widely spaced. Again, last time in the communities or populations, one of them, I can't remember, we talked about the distribution of organisms and how they can be clumped or random and so forth. And so in the desert, there's a lot of competition for water. And so the plants can't be very close together because one will outcompete the other, or they'll both die because there's not enough water. Only highly specialized plants can grow in the desert. Cacti, as you may be familiar with, are very prevalent there. They have very shallow spreading roots. They don't root down very deep because when it rains, they want to soak up that water as quickly as possible before it evaporates off in the heat. They have thicker stems, that can store water. And then also, as you know, they have spines on them to protect them from being eaten by herbivores. And also remember, cacti and succulents and other types of desert plants are what we call cam plants. If you remember that term back from our photosynthesis chapter last semester. Desert animals are also very adapted to survive heat and drought. A lot of them will take their shelter underground in burrows or under rocks and things like that, where they can get out of the sun, and maybe there's a cool, moist area that they can get to. Also, some animals have adapted to becoming nocturnal, where it's cooler at night to be able to go out and feed. Some reptiles of the deserts, we've talked about this some with animal behavior, but reptiles can adjust their behavior cycles, or I could say activity cycles, depending on temperature. So in the summer, they may be active in the night or in the cool parts of the day, and when it's cooler out, they may be active in the warmer parts of the day. And then there are some desert animals, some small desert animals that basically never drink. They survive without ever drinking. They get their water as a byproduct of metabolism through cellular respiration and other metabolic processes. And then some of the other larger mammals that live in the deserts, they're going to need to find a water source to survive. The fifth biome is the chaparral, and that's usually in some coastal areas that border deserts, like in Southern California. And then much of the Mediterranean areas. Their rainfall could be up to 30 inches of rain, and typically that rainfall is going to, or precipitation is going to come in the cool, wet winters, and the summers are going to be hot and dry, which can lead to lots of fires. Okay, so if you watch the news, you know that Southern California will have fires each year as that dry shrubland catches fire. And while we're speaking of fires, many shrubs grow up from their roots after a fire, and so they've adapted to that, to being able to survive being burnt off and coming back. And others, like in some of the forests as well, the seeds need to have high heat or chemicals from the smoke to be able to even germinate. So the fire can be actually beneficial to the plant life. The plants in the chaparral are going to have small waxy leaves, like with a waxy cuticle to reduce evaporation. The sixth one is the grassland, or also known as the prairie. Oh my gosh, I can't spell. Found in North America, like here in Southeast Colorado and parts of Eurasia. Typically hot summers. If you've spent a summer here, you know it's hot. The winters, we're far enough south, it's not necessarily super cold. We have fairly mild winters, but receive 15 to 30 inches of rain annually, and Lamar is on the low end of that, 12 to 15 inches. Typically there's virtually no trees except along rivers and a few, or along homesteads where people have planted and, you know, intentionally water the trees. Again, because the trees just cannot survive with the limited rainfall. Originally, the tall grass prairies in North America started down in Texas and went up into southern Canada, like Alberta and so forth, and had grasses that could reach up to 6 feet tall. I remember growing up in Illinois talking about how settlers came in and there were blue stem grasses that were taller than their horses and taller than people, very tall grasses in parts of Illinois as well. The short grass prairies, though, is where we would live right now, or Lamar area, is a short grass prairie dominated by buffalo grass and blue grama and things like that. Let's see. Number 7. Oh, I was going to mention too, your book talks about how the trees don't survive because of the drought and also fires. And Native Americans would actually purposefully set fire to the prairie to burn out trees and to also get rid of old growth. Like you can see the brown old growth from last year that helps. If you get rid of that, it helps clear out that dead material and give the new coming plants access to the sunlight and so forth. Okay, number 7, temperate deciduous forests. Along eastern edge of North America, so northeast US is a temperate deciduous forest. Again, remember deciduous means that they lose their leaves. Can be also found in Europe and eastern part of Asia. Typically 30 to 60 inches of rain in the summer. And the soil retains a lot of moisture for the trees to grow and shades out a lot of grasses. Okay, so the trees will have so much shade down here in these lower areas that grasses don't really thrive. They don't have enough sunlight. In the winter, a lot of times the ground will actually freeze. I lost my place, sorry. So you'll have long periods of below freezing temperatures and the soil will freeze throughout the winter. And so to conserve water, the deciduous trees, as you know, will drop their leaves and remain dormant throughout the winter. Another reason they do this is so their branches don't break. In heavy snowfall. Okay, because those leaves will, they have a lot of surface area to undergo efficient photosynthesis. That surface area, if they stay on the plant or the tree, can really grab onto a lot of snow too and become very heavy and break branches in snow or icy conditions. Number 8, is that correct? Yes, number 8. The temperate rainforest. Okay, so at the beginning we had tropical rainforest and tropical deciduous forest. Now we have temperate deciduous forests and temperate rainforests. And this temperate part means that it is farther from the equator. Okay. The tropical biomes are near the equator. The temperate are a little bit farther north or south. Temperate rainforests are found along the Pacific coast from northern California up through Canada and southeastern Alaska. Can also be found in Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and Argentina. In North America, though, this biome receives more than 55 inches, and sometimes these biomes can receive up to 12 feet of rain per year, which is a lot, or precipitation. Trees here are conifers. Okay, remember conifers are gymnosperms, so kind of reviewing back for the final as we're coming up. And then fungi are very prevalent as well because they really like moist areas. Number 9, moving farther north as well, is going to be the northern coniferous forest, or some textbooks call this the taiga. And this is the largest terrestrial biome on Earth. Okay, it's going to include Scandinavian Siberia, Central Alaska, Canada, and parts of other parts of the northern US. And these are areas where there's coniferous forests, but they're much, much harsher temperatures. There are long, cold winters, and very short growing seasons. They get about 60 to 40 inches of precipitation, and a lot of that is going to be snow. And so, as we know, those gymnosperms, the conifers, are going to be triangular in shape to help shed the snow off of them. And the needles are very narrow, and their waxy coating is going to help minimize water loss as well. Large mammals like to live in these areas, like moose and black bear and deer and wolves and so forth. Also a breeding ground for migratory birds. Two more of these. Number 10 is the tundra, and that is the most northerly biome. And it's going through the Arctic tundra, and it's a vast treeless area up by the Arctic Ocean. And conditions here are going to be pretty severe. Temperatures can regularly get 40 degrees Fahrenheit or below with very, very windy conditions. Very dry. Kind of makes it like a frozen desert. During the summer, there can be frosts even during July and August, and the growing season is very, very short. And here are some of the organisms that live here: caribou, Arctic fox, so forth. The climate, though, is so cold and it doesn't really warm up enough that it results in what's called permafrost, which is permanently frozen ground. So the soil would be permanently frozen to about 2 feet down, and only the top small layer thaws during the summer. Limits the ability of the soil when it does thaw to absorb water, and it becomes very marshy, but there are no trees here because they can't root down into that permafrost. So it's very, very shallow rooted marsh type plants that live here. So this wet marshy area is a perfect habitat for mosquitoes. And those mosquitoes and other insects feed a lot of different migratory birds. And we talked about wolves, Arctic hares, and Arctic foxes, and so forth. And this is supposed to be hares. I noticed this was a typo in your slide here. Hares. Okay, so that finishes up I lied, I guess there was only one. I thought we were doing 11. Finishes up our terrestrial biomes. And now we'll get into the aquatic biomes, the water biomes. Water biomes, as we said, are going to be very dependent upon sunlight and temperature, okay, but also the availability of nutrients, okay? So there's a wide variety of biomes as well in the aquatic ecosystems. And we'll talk about a couple of these. The first one is going to be freshwater lakes. And lakes can form when there's a natural depression in the land, and can be filled by streams that come in here, or runoff from melting snow or rain, or the groundwater. So you have a kind of a low area here. Maybe you get some streams filling in. You can also have groundwater that seeps up that can fill lakes as well. Very large lakes have different temperature zones. And so within those different temperature zones, there are different types of organisms that can live there. And so we'll talk about these. So here's the shoreline, obviously. This shallow area near the shoreline is called the littoral zone. Then we have the top layer here of water that gets good sunlight. It's called the limnetic zone. And then the profundal zone is basically the bottom of the lake. Okay, so life zones, okay, are going to be determined by light, nutrients, and temperature. Okay, and so near the shore, that shallow Littoral zone is going to get a lot of sunlight and nutrients. Plants here would be like cattails or water lilies, and they can anchor on the bottom. And then if you go further out, as we saw, as the lake gets a little bit deeper, light may not penetrate far enough to the bottom where plants can survive. Okay, so if we go back here, light can kind of reach the bottom here, but down here, as the deeper areas, light may not be able to penetrate if the lake is deep enough. So the open water areas, as you get away from the shore, is going to be divided into the littoral, or I'm sorry, wrong one, limnetic, and the profundal zones. Okay, so in the limnetic zone, there's enough light that's there that's able to support photosynthesis by plankton. And remember, plankton are protists. Okay, kind of review that a little bit. And some fish can survive here and feed on the plankton. In the profundal zone, though, there's not enough light. Okay, or if it's a deep enough lake, there may not be any light at all. So there's not enough light for photosynthesis. So here you're going to have detritivores, which things that feed on dead plants and animals, and decomposers. Things like catfish, crayfish, and so forth like that would live on the bottom. Let's see. Freshwater lakes can also be classified. So these are the different areas of a lake, but the lakes can be classified by different types based on their nutrient content. Okay, and those can be called oligotropic, eutrophic, or mesotropic, and this one's kind of like a middle in between these two here. So an oligotropic, okay, oligo means few, and tropic means feeding or food or nutrients. So there's few nutrients in these lakes, okay? And these would be like high mountain lakes where glaciers have basically melted or snow has melted, and the lakes and streams and so forth haven't picked up runoff and sediment and other things as it has developed. And so these lakes usually have high oxygen levels. Okay, and so here is a great place for fish that require well oxygenated water like trout. Okay, so since there's little sediment or little microbial life there, oligotropic lakes are clear. You can maybe see the bottom at 20 feet or something like that. You can see all the way down, and light penetrates really, really well. And for those of you that have been in micro, we talked a lot about turbidity. And so if there's very few microbes, plankton, protists, bacteria, dirt, sediment, things like that, the turbidity is going to be a lot less. And so that's basically what's happening here. So there's few nutrients here, but there's lots and lots of oxygen available for those fish and other life forms that require that. Okay, so these would be an example of those clear mountain, high mountain lakes that you would find. The other end of the extreme is the eutrophic lakes. And eutrophic lakes have relatively high or large inputs of sediment, organic material, and inorganic nutrients from the surrounding areas, from runoff and things like that. And so since there's a lot of nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and so forth, those lakes can support begin to grow lots and lots of dense plants. And so this would be an example of a eutrophic lake. There's a lot of phytoplankton, and the limnetic zone is very, very shallow because there's so much material here that light isn't able to penetrate very, very deeply. Also, in these types of lakes, oxygen level is very low. Okay, so as plants and other organisms die in the limnetic zone, in this type of lake, or any type of lake really, those dead organisms sink to the bottom into the profundal zone, where decomposers will feed on them. And these metabolic activities of the decomposers use up the oxygen. And so those eutrophic lakes tend to be very low in oxygen, and it supports very little fish life. Carp can live in these types of environments, but not many other fish can live in a eutrophic lake. Some human impacts, nutrients carried off or run off from agricultural usage, from human sewage, even lawns. I would say this one's probably the biggest one. You know, fertilizing your lawn is not regulated, and so people will be like, oh, I put a little fertilizer on, that's good. If I put a lot, that's even better. And then if it rains a lot, that those excess nutrients can go down into the storm drain and then out into the lakes and rivers. Are there nutrient runoff from these areas? Absolutely. But I just wanted to point out I used to work for a feedlot doing environmental management, a very large company actually, and my husband currently does that. And there are lots and lots of regulations. There's millions of dollars that feedlots have to put into to catch runoff. They have containment areas, they have berms that they have to put up to hold what they call a 25-year, 24-hour flood event, and so forth. And so runoffs from regulated feedlots are very, very, very few and far between because there are lots of environmental restrictions on them. Also, runoff from farms, from fields does occur, but the farmers don't want to have to put on any more fertilizer than they have to, because it's very, very costly. And so this does occur from these, but it's not like farmers are just out there polluting the rivers and the waters and things like that, like you sometimes hear about in the media. You're getting more unregulated over fertilization from these areas than you ever would from farms and feedlots and animal operations. But humans do inadvertently add extra nutrients to the runoff, which can get into rivers and ponds and lakes and things like that. And when you do get a lot of those nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and so forth, you can get huge blooms of plant life, and that can deplete the oxygen and kill off a bunch of fish. Let's see, streams and rivers. Another type of biome, that's two, an aquatic freshwater biome. Streams originate in what's called a source region or headwaters, often near mountainous areas. And the source of this rain or water is going to be from rainfall, snow melt, and perhaps glacial melt. Little sediment, again, like with the oligotrophic lakes, little sediment is found here. Phytoplankton is fairly sparse because there's not a lot of nutrients for them at this point, and the water is cold and clear, just like in those oligotrophic lakes or high mountain lakes. Algae grows on the rocks, and then the insect larvae may live there near the edges, but those higher areas okay, higher in elevation, closest to the source, are probably going to have some turbulent water, and that will provide oxygen as well, providing a home for those high oxygen requiring organisms. Okay, and so here the high mountain lake might be the source. Okay, and as it comes down, we get to other streams and so forth and tributaries that follow into here, and then you get to the transition zone from this high mountain area or kind of a oligotropic type region, transitioning into a floodplain and then perhaps into an estuary out into the ocean. So at lower elevations, the transition zone allows streams where smaller streams merge and form perhaps wider, slower moving streams or rivers. As you go down in elevation, the water starts to warm up a little bit. You get more and more sediment that carries nutrients for phytoplankton and other things to grow. In the transition zone, you may find fish that require a little bit less oxygen than trout, like bass and bluegill. And then as the land becomes lower in elevation and flatter, the river is going to continue to warm and slow and widen and kind of start to meander back and forth. You'll start to get more and more populations of phytoplankton, which makes the water more turbid or murky. Decomposing bacteria can start to deplete the water of oxygen, but again, fish like carp and catfish can survive in low oxygen levels. And sometimes the area surrounding the river may flood, and this is called the flood plain. Don't want to ever build a house in the floodplain. And then we get into the wetlands. Wetlands include things like marshes, swamps, and bogs. And this is going to be covered with water or soil that's very, very saturated in water. Lots of algae and phytoplankton that can grow here, rooted plants as well. A lot of animal life can live in the wetland area. And the soil here acts like a giant sponge that can absorb the water and help against flooding and erosions. And also, the wetland soil can act as a natural filter and water purifier. As water kind of suspends or goes through the soil,